The first reports came in just before sunrise, but by the time anyone understood what was happening, the pattern had already been established. This was not a single strike, not an isolated breach, not a failure that could be contained or explained away in a press briefing. This was something else entirely. Multiple impact points, multiple districts, a sequence of detonations spaced just far enough apart to prevent recovery, but close enough together to create the illusion that the city itself had become the target, not specific infrastructure within it. And within minutes, the realization set in that the system everyone had been told would hold, would absorb, intercept, neutralize, was no longer functioning in the way it had been promised. What made this moment different wasn't just the scale, it was the rhythm. Previous attacks had followed a familiar structure, a wave, a pause, an assessment window, time to respond, time to regroup, time to restore a sense, however fragile, of control. This time, there was no pause, no recovery window, just a continuous sequence of incoming threats that forced the defensive network into a constant state of engagement, draining its capacity with every passing minute. Each interception attempt reduced the likelihood of the next one succeeding. Each decision to respond came at the cost of being able to respond again. And then came the detail that shifted this from a crisis into something far more destabilizing. The weapons being used were not behaving in ways the defense systems had been designed to counter. Traditional threat models relied on predictability, on trajectories that could be calculated, paths that could be anticipated. But this time, the incoming projectiles weren't following those rules. They weren't arriving from expected angles or maintaining stable flight patterns. They were adjusting mid-course, altering their descent profiles, compressing the time between detection and impact into seconds instead of minutes. The margin for error, already thin, effectively disappeared. This wasn't a gap in performance. It was a mismatch between design and reality. The defensive architecture, layered and sophisticated as it was, had been built for a different era of threat, one where speed and maneuverability had limits. What it faced now had neither in any meaningful sense. And as the barrage continued, that mismatch became visible in the only way it ever does. Not in technical briefings, not in classified reports, but in the growing number of impacts that were no longer being stopped. Across the city, emergency channels began to overload. Calls stacked faster than they could be answered. Dispatch systems struggled to prioritize incidents because there was no longer a clear hierarchy of urgency. Everything was urgent. Everything was simultaneous. Fires broke out in areas that had not been struck directly. Secondary effects cascading through infrastructure that had already been weakened by weeks of sustained pressure. Transportation routes became obstructed, not just by damage, but by the sheer volume of response vehicles attempting to reach too many locations at once. And still, the strikes continued. What turned this from a military event into a systemic failure was not just the inability to intercept every incoming threat that had never been the expectation, but the inability to manage what happened after impact. Emergency services rely on sequencing. Stabilize one site, then move to the next. Allocate resources based on severity. Maintain flow. That entire model collapses when new incidents are generated faster than existing ones can be contained. What remained was not a coordinated response, but a fragmented one, units operating independently, often without updated information, trying to navigate a situation that was evolving faster than the systems designed to track it. The silence from official channels only amplified the uncertainty, not because silence is unusual in moments like this, it isn't, but because of what it tends to indicate. When information is withheld, it's often to maintain control over the narrative. But when there is no narrative, when the situation is too fluid, too visible, too overwhelming to frame, the silence takes on a different meaning. It becomes less about strategy and more about limitation, an inability to provide clarity because clarity no longer exists. What was unfolding wasn't just an escalation. It was a shift in the underlying assumptions that had defined the entire conflict up to this point. The belief that the system could hold under sustained pressure. The belief that even degraded, it could still provide meaningful protection. The belief that any failure would be temporary, explainable, recoverable. One by one, those assumptions were being tested, not in theory, but in real time, under conditions that allowed no margin for adjustment. And as the morning progressed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't designed to break through once. It was designed to keep breaking through, again and again, until there was nothing left to stop it. To understand how the situation reached this point, you have to look at the nature of the weapons driving the shift. For years, defensive systems were engineered around a simple assumption that incoming threats would behave within predictable physical constraints. Even when those threats were fast, even when they arrived in large numbers, their trajectories could be mapped, their descent calculated, their interception timed with enough precision to create a workable margin of defense. That assumption no longer holds. What is being deployed now operates outside those expectations, not by incremental improvement, but by fundamentally changing how a strike reaches its target. These systems do not simply travel faster, they move differently. After an initial launch phase that resembles older ballistic designs, they transition into a glide profile that allows them to maneuver dynamically through the atmosphere. That maneuverability is the critical factor. It breaks the logic of prediction. A defense network can calculate where something will be based on where it has been, but if that object can alter its path in the final moments before impact, those calculations lose their value. The entire intercept chain, detection, tracking, solution, response, depends on stability. Remove that stability, and the system begins to lag behind reality. Speed compounds that problem. When the time between detection and impact is reduced to mere seconds, there is no room for layered decision-making, no time to verify, to cross-check, to allocate the optimal interceptor. The system reacts, not because it has confidence in the solution, but because hesitation guarantees failure, and reaction under pressure is expensive. Each interceptor launched is one less available for the next incoming object. In a sustained sequence, that depletion becomes the defining constraint. It is not just about whether the system can stop a single threat, but whether it can continue stopping threats as its own resources diminish. That is where the structure of the barrage becomes decisive. This is not random timing. It is not a chaotic release of firepower. It is calibrated. Each wave is spaced to ensure that the defensive system remains in continuous engagement mode, never given the operational pause required to reset. Interceptors are launched. Tracking systems are saturated. Command units are forced into constant prioritization. And before the system can stabilize, the next wave arrives. Over time, the effect is cumulative. Not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion of capacity until the point is reached where the system is still functioning, but no longer effective. Previous engagements used advanced projectiles as breakthrough tools, limited deployments designed to create openings for more conventional follow-up strikes. That approach relied on a mix of capabilities, combining unpredictability with volume. What is happening now abandons that mix entirely. The advanced systems are no longer supporting elements. They are the primary method of attack. That shift matters because it removes the defensive system's ability to fall back on familiarity. There is no simpler threat to prioritize, no predictable wave to recover against. Every incoming object demands maximum attention, maximum resources, maximum response. On the ground, that technical shift translates into a very different kind of impact pattern. Instead of isolated strike zones that can be cordoned off and managed, there are simultaneous points of failure spread across multiple districts. Infrastructure that depends on continuity, power grids, communication lines, transport corridors, begins to fragment under the strain. A disruption in one area cascades into others, not because they were directly targeted, but because the systems connecting them were already under pressure. What emerges is not just damage, but disconnection. Pieces of a city operating without synchronization, each dealing with its own crisis in partial isolation. Emergency response is where that disconnection becomes most visible. Coordination systems rely on accurate, timely information. They depend on knowing where resources are, where they are needed, and how quickly they can be moved. When new incidents are generated faster than that information can be processed, coordination breaks down. Units are dispatched based on outdated data. Routes planned minutes earlier become unusable. Facilities expecting one level of demand are suddenly faced with double or triple that number without warning. The system doesn't fail all at once. It fractures, each component struggling independently to keep up. And yet, despite the visible strain, the official narrative has not adjusted. Public messaging continues to emphasize resilience, control, capability. But the gap between that messaging and observable reality is widening. People are not relying on briefings to understand what is happening. They are seeing it directly, hearing it, experiencing it in real time. When that gap grows too large, credibility becomes part of the crisis. Not because of what is said, but because of what can no longer be believed. This is the point where a technical problem becomes a strategic one. It is no longer just about whether a system can intercept incoming threats. It is about whether the framework built around that system, the assumptions, the policies, the promises, can withstand the evidence of its limitations. Because once those limitations are visible at scale, they cannot be contained within military analysis. They spill into public perception, into political stability, into the broader question of whether the approach that led to this moment can still justify itself. And as the barrage continues, that question becomes harder to delay, let alone answer. What follows next is not defined by the weapons themselves, but by the pressure they create on every system surrounding them. Because once the defensive layer begins to lose consistency, the burden shifts immediately to what comes after impact. And that burden is not theoretical. It is physical, logistical, human. Emergency networks that were designed to absorb shocks now face something closer to saturation. Not because they were weak, but because they were never intended to operate under conditions where multiple high-intensity incidents unfold faster than response cycles can complete. In a normal escalation, response teams move with sequence. A strike occurs, resources are deployed, containment begins, stabilization follows. Even under heavy pressure, that chain holds because there is time, limited but sufficient, to move from one phase to the next. What is happening now removes that sequence entirely. Teams responding to one incident are overtaken by another before they can finish. Fire units arriving at one location are redirected mid-operation as new reports come in from districts experiencing even greater damage. Medical facilities begin triage protocols not as a precaution, but as a necessity, because the volume of incoming casualties exceeds their ability to treat sequentially. The result is a system that continues to function, but in fragments. Not coordinated, not optimized, but reactive in isolated pockets. One district may receive a concentrated response while another waits, not because it is less affected, but because there are simply no units left to dispatch. Communication lines remain open, but the information flowing through them is delayed, incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Command centers attempt to maintain an overview, but the pace of change outruns their ability to update the operational picture in real time. This is where the psychological dimension begins to take hold. Because for the population experiencing this, the shift is immediate and unmistakable. The expectation of protection gives way to the experience of exposure. Not total, not absolute, but enough to change behavior. People begin making decisions not based on official guidance, but on what they perceive directly, where they believe the next impact might occur, which areas seem safer, which routes remain usable. That decentralization of decision-making introduces its own risks as movement patterns become unpredictable, sometimes placing individuals in greater danger rather than less. At the same time, the absence of clear, consistent information begins to shape perception in ways that are difficult to reverse. Silence from authorities creates space, and that space is quickly filled by speculation, by fragmented reports, by images that circulate faster than they can be verified. Each piece of information, accurate or not, contributes to a broader sense that the situation is no longer fully understood, even by those managing it. And once that perception takes hold, restoring confidence becomes significantly harder than maintaining it would have been. Politically, this is where pressure concentrates, not in abstract debates or long-term strategy, but in the immediate question of accountability. The assurances that were given about preparedness, about capability, about resilience, were not technical statements. They were commitments, communicated with certainty. When those commitments encounter visible contradiction, the response cannot rely on technical explanations alone, because the issue is no longer whether a system performed within expected parameters. It is whether those expectations were defined correctly in the first place. For leadership, that creates a narrowing set of options. Acknowledge the gap and risk amplifying instability. Delay acknowledgement and risk losing credibility entirely. Attempt to reframe the situation and risk appearing disconnected from reality. None of those paths offer a clean resolution, especially while the underlying conditions remain unchanged. As long as the pressure continues, every statement is measured against ongoing events, and every discrepancy is magnified. Externally, the implications extend beyond the immediate conflict. Other governments, other defense planners are watching the same sequence unfold. Not just the effectiveness of the weapons, but the response to them. The speed at which systems degrade under sustained pressure. The point at which infrastructure begins to fracture. The threshold where public messaging diverges from operational reality. Each of those observations feeds into a broader reassessment of what constitutes effective defense in this new environment. And that is where the significance of this moment expands. It is no longer confined to a single city or a single exchange. It becomes a reference point, a demonstration of how quickly established assumptions can be invalidated when confronted with a different class of threat deployed in a different way. Not as a single breakthrough, not as an isolated escalation, but as a sustained condition that forces every layer of response, military, civilian, political, to operate beyond the limits it was designed for. As the situation continues to evolve, the distinction between temporary disruption and structural change becomes harder to maintain. Because if the pressure does not ease, if the pattern holds, then what is being tested is not just capacity, but the underlying model itself. And models, once disproven in real time, are not easily restored. By the time the situation reaches this stage, the question is no longer what is happening, but what it means going forward. Because once a system has been pushed past the point where it can reliably perform its core function, every decision that follows is shaped by that reality. Not the version presented in briefings, not the version outlined in strategic plans, but the version that is visible in outcomes. And those outcomes are now defining the trajectory of the conflict more than any stated objective ever did. What makes this moment particularly difficult to navigate is that it offers no clean transition. There is no clear point where the pressure stops and reassessment begins. The conditions that expose the limitations are still active, still unfolding, still forcing responses in real time. That removes the space required for controlled adjustment. Instead, adaptation happens under strain, with incomplete information and diminishing resources. Every attempt to stabilize is immediately tested by the next development, and every delay compounds the challenge of regaining control. The military dimension remains central, but it is no longer isolated. The performance of defensive systems now intersects directly with political viability, public confidence, and strategic credibility. A capability that was once presented as a guarantee is now understood as conditional, dependent on factors that are no longer stable. That shift cannot be reversed through messaging alone. It requires either a change in conditions or a change in expectations. Without one of those, the gap between what is promised and what is delivered continues to widen. For leadership, this creates a moment of forced clarity. The objectives defined at the outset of the conflict were built on assumptions about capability and control. If those assumptions no longer hold, then the objectives themselves come into question, not because they were unrealistic at the time they were set, but because the environment in which they were meant to be achieved has changed. Continuing along the same path without adjustment risks extending a strategy that no longer aligns with reality. Adjusting the strategy, however, carries its own costs: political, reputational, and operational. This is where the timeline becomes critical. The longer the current conditions persist, the more difficult it becomes to maintain continuity with earlier phases of the conflict. Each additional day reinforces the perception that what is happening is not a temporary disruption, but a new baseline. And once that perception takes hold, it influences every subsequent decision, from resource allocation to diplomatic positioning. It alters how allies interpret commitments, how adversaries assess opportunities, and how internal audiences evaluate leadership. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity. Observers are not just watching the events themselves, but the responses to them, how quickly adjustments are made, how transparently limitations are addressed, how effectively stability is restored. These factors shape broader assessments of reliability and capability, extending beyond the immediate context. In that sense, the impact of what is happening is not confined to the present conflict. It feeds into a wider recalibration of expectations across multiple regions and scenarios. At the same time, the human dimension remains constant. Regardless of strategic calculations or political considerations, the immediate reality is experienced at ground level. Disruption to daily life, uncertainty about safety, the strain on essential services. These are not abstract consequences. They accumulate, influencing behavior, perception, and resilience in ways that cannot be easily measured, but are deeply consequential. Any response that fails to account for that dimension risks overlooking the very factors that determine long-term stability. And so the situation arrives at a point where multiple pressures converge. Military effectiveness, political accountability, public perception, and international credibility all intersect, each influencing the others. There is no single lever that can be adjusted to resolve all of them simultaneously. Progress in one area may create strain in another. Delay in one may complicate the rest. The challenge is not just to respond, but to respond in a way that acknowledges the interconnected nature of the problem. What remains uncertain is how quickly that acknowledgement will translate into action. Because recognition alone does not alter conditions. It only defines the starting point for change. And until that change occurs, until the gap between expectation and reality is addressed in a tangible way, the pattern that has emerged will continue to define the situation. This is the turning point not because it marks an end, but because it removes the option of continuing without adaptation. The conditions have shifted, the assumptions have been tested, and the outcomes are now visible in ways that cannot be reframed or deferred. What comes next will depend not on whether those realities are understood, but on how they are acted upon.